Franz von Werra, the German pilot who escaped the British and made it back home. Before we begin this incredible true story of escape, courage, and determination, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't believe how one man defied impossible odds to make it home. This is a story Hollywood couldn't make up because it actually happened. Let's dive in. September 5th, 1940. The skies over Kent, England, roared with the thunder of aerial combat. Franz von Werra, a 26-year-old Luftwaffe fighter pilot, was hunting British aircraft during the height of the Battle of Britain, known to his squadron mates as the Baron. Werra was the epitome of German fighter pilot swagger, confident, skilled, and adorned with decorations. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 bore the distinctive markings of his unit, and painted on the fuselage was the Devil's Head, his personal emblem. He had already shot down multiple enemy aircraft and wore the Iron Cross proudly on his uniform. That afternoon, Werra was part of a massive Luftwaffe formation escorting bombers to attack British targets. The sky was a chaotic maze of tracer fire, smoke trails, and screaming engines. British Spitfires and Hurricanes tore through the German formations with desperate ferocity. These were the darkest days for Britain, standing alone against Nazi Germany, fighting for survival. Every pilot who took to the skies knew they might not return. As Werra engaged a British fighter, his aircraft suddenly shuddered. Bullets had found their mark. Smoke began pouring from his engine. The controls became sluggish, unresponsive. His altitude was dropping fast. The once mighty hunter was now prey, spiraling toward the English countryside below. Werra wrestled with the dying aircraft, but it was no use. At around 1,500 feet, he made the decision that would change his life. He bailed out. The parachute deployed with a violent jerk, and suddenly the chaos of combat was replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the distant rumble of aircraft engines. Below him, the green patchwork of English fields grew larger. Werra's mind was already racing. He wasn't thinking about being captured. He was thinking about escaping. As his boots touched British soil near Marden, Kent, he saw them approaching. British soldiers and Home Guard members, rifles raised. The locals had watched him descend. There would be no running, not now. Franz von Werra, the decorated Luftwaffe ace, was now a prisoner of war. But in his mind, the war wasn't over. In fact, for Franz von Werra, it had only just begun. As the British soldiers roughly searched him and bound his hands, Werra remained calm, almost defiant. He had heard stories of POW camps, of men who spent years behind barbed wire, their spirits broken, waiting for war to end. That would not be his fate. He made himself a promise in that moment, standing in that English field with his captors surrounding him. He would escape. No matter what it took, no matter how many attempts it required, he would find his way back to Germany, back to the fatherland, back to the fight. The British didn't know it yet, but they had captured one of the most determined men they would ever face, a man who would become a legend not for his victories in the air, but for his relentless refusal to accept defeat on the ground. Franz von Werra was transported to the London cage, an interrogation center where captured German aircrew were questioned. The British intelligence officers were professional, even courteous, but they wanted information, squadron numbers, aircraft capabilities, airfield locations. Werra gave them nothing but his name, rank, and service number, as required by the Geneva Convention. But even during these initial interrogations, his captors noticed something unusual about this prisoner. He didn't have the defeated demeanor of most captured airmen. His eyes were constantly moving, observing, calculating. He asked questions about where he was being held, how far to the coast, what security measures were in place. The interrogators made notes. This one will try to escape. They were right. Within days of his capture, Werra was already planning his first escape attempt. He was initially held at a temporary facility before being transferred to a more permanent POW camp. During a train journey to the camp, Werra noticed the window in the toilet compartment was large enough for a man to squeeze through. The train would slow down at certain points. It was possible, dangerous, but possible. He waited for the right moment. then excused himself to use the facilities. The guard, believing the doors were secure, waited outside. Werra worked quickly, forcing open the window. The countryside rushed past below him. The train was moving faster than he had hoped. But there would be no better opportunity. He squeezed through the narrow opening and jumped. The impact was brutal. He hit the ground hard, rolling violently down an embankment. Pain shot through his body, but nothing felt broken. He had made it. He was free. For exactly 4 hours. A massive manhunt was launched. Police, home guard, and military units scoured the area. With his distinctly foreign appearance and limited English, Werra stood out like a beacon. He was recaptured before nightfall, cold, hungry, and covered in mud. The British authorities were not amused. He was placed under stricter security and transferred to a POW camp with the reputation for being escape-proof. But if the British thought this would discourage Franz von Werra, they fundamentally misunderstood the man they were dealing with. At the POW camp, Werra immediately began studying the security arrangements, guard rotation patterns, the height and construction of the fences, the distance to the nearest village. He befriended other prisoners, particularly those who spoke better English, learning phrases that might help him pass as a foreign worker if he escaped again. He exercised daily, keeping himself in peak physical condition. Some prisoners settled into the routine of camp life, finding comfort in stability and safety. Not Werra. Every single day, he was planning, preparing, and waiting for another opportunity. His fellow prisoners began to see him as either admirably determined or dangerously obsessed. Perhaps he was both. The British guards watched him carefully, knowing he was trouble. But even constant surveillance couldn't stop a man like Franz von Werra. He would try again, and again, and again. Failure was merely a learning experience, not a deterrent. With each attempt, he learned more about British security, about the geography, about what worked and what didn't. Franz von Werra's second escape attempt was audacious and nearly succeeded. The POW camp held both German aircrew and other captured personnel, and security, while tight, had vulnerabilities. Werra and several other prisoners spent weeks digging a tunnel from one of the barracks. Using stolen and improvised tools, spoons, pieces of wood, metal scraps, they excavated a passage under the wire fence. The work was backbreaking and dangerous. The tunnel could collapse at any moment, burying them alive. Guards conducted random inspections. Discovery meant solitary confinement, possibly worse. They worked at night, taking turns digging while others kept watch. The excavated dirt had to be carefully disposed of, hidden in pockets and scattered in the exercise yard without arousing suspicion. It took incredible coordination and nerve. Finally, after weeks of effort, the tunnel was complete. It emerged just beyond the outer fence, in a wooded area that offered cover. The escape was planned for a moonless night. 6 prisoners would go, including Werra. The night arrived. One by one, they crawled through the narrow, claustrophobic tunnel. Werra's heart pounded as he inched forward in complete darkness, soil pressing in from all sides. Then fresh air. Freedom. They emerged into the night and scattered in different directions as planned. Werra headed toward what he believed was the coast, moving through fields and forests, avoiding roads and villages. He traveled for miles, driven by the thought of somehow reaching Germany, perhaps stealing a boat, or finding a neutral ship. But dawn brought disaster. As daylight broke, Werra found himself exposed in open countryside with nowhere to hide. A farmer spotted him and alerted the authorities. Once again, police descended. Werra was exhausted, hungry, and out of options. His second escape had lasted less than 24 hours. He was recaptured and sent to solitary confinement as punishment. The tiny cell was dark, cold, and isolating. Many men would have broken under such conditions, but Werra's spirit remained unbroken. If anything, confinement only hardened his resolve. His third escape attempt was perhaps his most creative. During a transfer between camps, Werra managed to convince the guards that he needed medical attention. The British, adhering to Geneva Convention protocols, took him to a hospital under guard. At the hospital, Werra pretended to be more seriously ill than he was, buying time to study the facility's layout. One night, he slipped away from his guard, who had dozed off during a quiet night shift, and made it outside. This time, Werra tried a different approach. Instead of running to the countryside, he attempted to blend into the urban environment, hoping to reach London and somehow contact neutral diplomats or find passage on a neutral vessel. He wore civilian clothes stolen from the hospital and tried to pass himself off as a Dutch or Norwegian worker. There were many displaced foreign nationals in Britain at the time. For 3 days, he moved through southern England, sleeping in barns and stealing food where he could. But his luck ran out when a suspicious shopkeeper heard his accent and contacted police. Once more, Werra was captured. The British authorities were becoming increasingly frustrated with this persistent escape artist. After his third attempt, they made a decision. Franz von Werra would be sent to Canada. The camp there was far more remote, thousands of miles from Germany, with an entire ocean and a neutral United States between the prisoner and home. Surely, they thought, even the most determined escape artist couldn't overcome those obstacles. It would be the ultimate escape-proof prison. Franz von Werra, they believed, had finally met his match. In January 1941, Franz von Werra stood on the deck of a British transport ship, the HMS Duchess of York, watching the gray waters of the Atlantic pass by. He was one of hundreds of German POWs being transferred to camps in Canada. The British had concluded that keeping high-risk prisoners like Werra in England was too dangerous. The proximity to Germany made escape attempts inevitable, and the resources required for constant vigilance were needed elsewhere. Canada offered the perfect solution. Remote camps far from any war zone, surrounded by vast wilderness and an ocean away from the Reich. The journey across the Atlantic was long and monotonous. The prisoners were held in cramped quarters below deck, the air thick with the smell of bodies and diesel fuel. U-boats prowled these waters, and everyone aboard knew that at any moment a torpedo could tear through the hull. But for Werra, the journey was useful. He talked to other prisoners, gathering information about Canada, the geography, the climate, the layout of the camps. He learned that Canada bordered the United States, which was still neutral at this point in the war. That detail lodged itself in his mind like a key fitting into a lock. When the ship finally docked in Halifax, Nova Scotia, the prisoners were met by bitterly cold January weather. Snow blanketed the landscape, and temperatures plunged well below freezing. The German prisoners, many of whom had never experienced such extreme cold, were hustled onto trains for the journey inland to their designated camps. Werra was sent to Camp 21 in Gravenhest, Ontario, about 100 miles north of Toronto. The camp was surrounded by frozen lakes and forests as far as the eye could see. The conditions at Camp 21 were harsh. The wooden barracks offered little insulation against the brutal Canadian winter. Prisoners slept in bunks with thin blankets, waking to find frost on the inside of the windows. Food was basic: porridge, bread, occasional meat. The guards were professional but distant, and the camp routine was strictly enforced. Roll calls, work details, limited recreation time. For most prisoners, the overwhelming remoteness and the hostile environment made escape seem impossible. How could anyone survive in this frozen wilderness, even if they got past the wire? But Franz von Werra saw something the others didn't: opportunity. Yes, the cold was brutal, but the harsh winter also meant fewer guards would be patrolling outdoors for extended periods. The frozen lakes, which seemed like barriers, could actually serve as highways for someone desperate enough to use them. And most importantly, the United States border was tantalizingly close, just a train ride away. If he could escape the camp and reach American territory, the neutral U.S. government would be legally obligated not to return him to British custody. From there, he could find his way to a German consulate, and eventually home. Werra began his preparations immediately. He observed every detail of the camp's security. He noted that trains carrying lumber and supplies passed near the camp regularly. He learned which guards were attentive and which were more relaxed. He befriended prisoners who had been in Canada longer and understood the local geography. He studied maps in the camp library, memorizing the layout of southern Ontario and the locations of border crossings. while other prisoners huddled around stoves, complaining about the cold and counting the days until the war's end. Franz von Werra was planning the most daring escape of his life. The British had sent him to Canada thinking it would be his final prison. Instead, they had brought him closer to freedom than he had ever been. The only thing standing between him and Germany now was barbed wire, frozen wilderness, an international border, and several thousand miles of enemy territory. For Franz von Werra, those were acceptable odds. January 21st, 1941. The temperature at Camp 21 was minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill making it feel even colder. Snow crunched underfoot, and breath crystallized in the air. It was during an outdoor work detail that Franz von Werra made his move. He had been assigned, along with other prisoners, to clear snow from the camp's access roads, routine maintenance that required prisoners to work outside the main compound under guard supervision. Werra had spent weeks preparing for this moment. He wore multiple layers of clothing stolen and saved from various sources. He had hidden a small amount of food in his pockets. Most importantly, he had studied the timing of the guards' movements and identified a brief window when he would be out of direct sight. As the work party moved along the road near a wooded area, Werra saw his chance. While the guards were focused on other prisoners, he simply walked away into the tree line. It sounds simple, almost absurdly so, but it was executed with perfect timing and nerve. By the time the guards realized he was missing, probably only a few minutes, Werra had disappeared into the forest. The alarm was raised immediately. Dogs were brought in. Search parties were organized. But Werra had a head start, and more importantly, he had a plan. He moved through the frozen forest with singular purpose, heading south. The cold was his enemy, but also his ally. It kept pursuers from staying out too long. He couldn't risk staying in the forest for long either. Exposure would kill him within hours if he stopped moving. His goal was to reach the railway line he knew ran south from the area. If he could hop a freight train heading toward the border, he might have a chance. After several hours of brutal hiking through snow-covered terrain, Werra reached the rail line. He was freezing, exhausted, but still moving. He found a spot where the tracks curved, forcing trains to slow down, and waited in the darkness. The cold bit through his layers of clothing. His fingers and toes were going numb. If a train didn't come soon, he would have to abandon this plan or risk freezing to death. Then he heard it, the distant rumble of a locomotive. A freight train appeared, moving slowly around the curve, just as he had hoped. Werra burst from his hiding place and ran alongside the train, grabbing onto a ladder on one of the boxcars. His frozen hands nearly lost their grip, but adrenaline gave him strength. He pulled himself up and onto the train, then found shelter between two cars, out of the wind. The train rumbled south through the night. Werra had no idea exactly where it was going, but south was all that mattered. He rode for hours, his body slowly recovering some warmth from the exertion and the slight shelter from the wind. When dawn broke, he could see the landscape passing by. Small towns, frozen lakes, forests. He waited until the train slowed near what looked like a good-sized town, then jumped off. He was in the town of Prescott, Ontario, right on the St. Lawrence River, which formed the border between Canada and the United States. Across that frozen river was freedom, but the river was being watched. Border patrols on both sides monitored crossings. Simply walking across, even on the ice, would likely result in immediate capture. Werra needed a different approach. He needed to not just reach the United States. He needed to do it in a way that would give him time to establish himself before anyone realized who he was. And that's when Franz von Werra hatched perhaps the boldest part of his entire escape. He would convince someone to drive him across the border legally. Franz von Werra stood in Prescott, Ontario, cold, hungry, but closer to freedom than he had been since his capture. The St. Lawrence River stretched before him, frozen solid, with the United States visible on the far shore. But Werra knew that crossing the ice would be suicide. Border patrols on both sides watched for exactly that kind of crossing, especially with the war on. He needed to cross legally, which meant he needed a car, proper documents, and a convincing story. Werra's command of English was imperfect, but adequate. He had spent months in British custody learning phrases and refining his accent by listening to guards and other prisoners. He decided to pose as a distressed Royal Canadian Air Force officer who had been in a car accident and needed to reach the American side to meet fellow officers stationed at an airfield near the border. It was a risky gambit. The story had holes that wouldn't stand up to serious scrutiny, but it relied on the natural human tendency to help someone in uniform who appeared to be in genuine distress. He spotted a service station and approached the attendant with his story. The man was initially suspicious. Werra's accent was noticeable, and his appearance was disheveled. But Werra had learned one crucial skill during his time in captivity: confidence. He spoke with authority, dropping names of Canadian military units he had heard mentioned in camp, describing a fictitious accident scenario with convincing detail. The key was not to give the man time to think too carefully about the inconsistencies. Amazingly, it worked. The attendant, either convinced or simply not wanting to refuse someone who might be a genuine military officer, agreed to drive Werra toward the international bridge that connected Canada to the United States at this point. As they drove, Werra's heart pounded. Every moment he expected the alarm to be raised, police cars to appear with sirens wailing. But the Canadian countryside remained quiet. When they reached the bridge approach, Werra thanked the attendant and said he would walk from here. His colleagues were supposedly meeting him on the American side. He approached the Canadian border checkpoint with forced casualness. The guard glanced at him briefly. Werra, still playing his role as an RCF officer, gave a casual salute and comment about crossing over for a meeting. The guard, perhaps accustomed to routine military crossings in this border area, waved him through without asking for papers. Werra walked across the bridge, trying to keep his pace normal despite every instinct screaming at him to run. Behind him was Canada, the British Empire captivity. Ahead was the United States, neutral territory where the British could not legally touch him. Each step brought him closer. The American border checkpoint loomed ahead. When he reached the U.S. side, the American border guard was more thorough. Purpose of entry? Werra again spun his story, but the American was skeptical. You got identification? Werra patted his pockets, feigning surprise that he had left his papers in the car after the supposed accident. The guard's eyes narrowed. You'll need to step inside the office, sir. In the border office, Werra faced more questions. The Americans weren't hostile, but they were professional. His story was starting to unravel. Then Werra made a critical decision. He told them the truth, or at least a version of it. He revealed that he was a German officer, a prisoner of war who had escaped from Canada, and under international law, he was requesting sanctuary in neutral territory. The Americans couldn't return him to British custody without violating neutrality. The officials were stunned. They had never encountered a situation quite like this. Phone calls were made to superiors. Werra was detained, not arrested, but held while officials decided what to do. For hours he waited, unsure if he would be sent back across the bridge or not. Finally, the decision came down from Washington. As he had claimed, international law prevented the U.S. from returning him to British custody. He would be interned in the United States as an escaped POW from a belligerent nation. Franz von Werra had done it. He was on American soil, and the British could not touch him. But he wasn't free yet. He was interned, held in detention while diplomats figured out what to do with him. Still, he was closer to home than any other escaped German POW in Allied custody. And Franz von Werra wasn't finished yet. Franz von Werra's arrival in the United States created a diplomatic headache. America was officially neutral in early 1941, though increasingly sympathetic to Britain. The British immediately demanded his return, arguing that he was an escaped prisoner and should be extradited. The German government, meanwhile, saw propaganda gold, a heroic officer who had escaped from the enemy and reached neutral ground. They wanted him back and publicized his story widely. Werra was held in immigration detention in New York while diplomats and lawyers argued. The British case was straightforward. He was a military prisoner who had escaped custody and should be returned. But Werra's lawyers made an equally compelling argument based on international law. The United States was neutral, and returning him would violate the neutrality by effectively rendering assistance to one belligerent over another. The case dragged through legal channels for weeks. During this time, Werra became something of a celebrity. Newspapers covered the story of the German ace, who had escaped across continents. He gave interviews, carefully managed by his lawyers, portraying himself as a soldier who had simply done his duty by trying to return to his unit. He was charming, articulate, and became a sympathetic figure to many Americans who admired audacity and determination, regardless of which side of the war someone was on. While the legal battle continued, the German consulate in New York was working behind the scenes. They arranged for Werra to be moved to less restrictive detention and began planning his route home. The plan was complex. He would travel to Mexico, which had diplomatic relations with Germany, then from Mexico to South America, across the Atlantic to Spain, officially neutral but friendly to Germany, and finally home to the Reich. In April 1941, the legal rulings finally came through. American courts determined that Werra could not be forcibly returned to British custody. He was released from detention into the custody of German diplomatic officials. The British were furious, but there was nothing they could do. Within days, Werra was on a train heading south to Mexico. The journey to Mexico was the first time in months that Werra felt truly safe. He traveled under diplomatic protection, and once across the Mexican border, he was beyond British reach. In Mexico City, he was treated as a hero by the German community. The embassy arranged his passage on a ship to Peru, then another to Brazil. From Brazil, he would board a ship bound for Spain. The Atlantic crossing was dangerous. British naval patrols and submarines controlled much of the Atlantic, and any ship they stopped would be searched. But the vessel Werra traveled on was neutral flagged and managed to avoid interception. In July 1941, Franz von Werra stepped onto Spanish soil in Barcelona. He was given new papers, a new uniform, and transportation to the German border. When Franz von Werra finally crossed from Spain into occupied France, and then into Germany proper, he was greeted as a national hero. The propaganda machine went into full swing. Here was proof of German superiority and determination. An officer who had escaped from the heart of the British Empire and made his way home through sheer will and cleverness. He was paraded before crowds, interviewed extensively, and his story was featured in newspapers and newsreels across Germany. Werra was promoted and awarded additional decorations. He met with high-ranking Luftwaffe officers and even Nazi officials who wanted to hear his story firsthand. Books were planned, movie deals discussed. He had become larger than life, the only German POW to successfully escape from Canada and make it home. Out of thousands of prisoners held by the British and Canadians, only one had done it. Franz von Werra. But heroic status and propaganda value aside, Werra was still a fighter pilot at heart. He hadn't endured months of captivity and escaped across half the world just to become a celebrity giving speeches. He demanded to return to combat duty. The Luftwaffe, recognizing his value both as a symbol and as an experienced pilot, agreed. Franz von Werra would fly again. October 25, 1941. Franz von Werra sat in the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109, preparing for what should have been a routine patrol mission over the North Sea. He had been back in Germany for only 3 months, but in that time he had readjusted to military life and was eager to return to combat. The escape, the journey home, the celebration, all of that was behind him now. He was a fighter pilot again, doing what he did best. The mission that day was a standard reconnaissance and patrol flight along the Dutch coast. Nothing particularly dangerous. Certainly nothing compared to the chaos of the Battle of Britain, where he had been shot down. Weather conditions were acceptable, visibility good. Werra went through his pre-flight checks with the practiced efficiency of an experienced pilot. Engine roaring to life, instruments reading normal. He taxied to the runway and took off, climbing into the gray autumn sky. What happened next remains unclear even today. Approximately 30 minutes into the flight, while flying over the North Sea near the island of Vlissingen in the Netherlands, Werra's aircraft experienced catastrophic engine failure. Fellow pilots in the formation reported seeing his plane suddenly lose power and began descending rapidly. Werra transmitted a brief distress call, his voice calm even in crisis, the mark of a professional pilot. He attempted to reach the coast, to find somewhere, anywhere, to set the aircraft down. But the engine had failed completely, and he was losing altitude too quickly. The North Sea stretched cold and gray below him. Werra had two choices: try to ditch the aircraft in the water and hope for rescue, or bail out and take his chances in the sea. Either option in the cold North Sea waters was effectively a death sentence, without immediate rescue. Witnesses, both from other aircraft and observers on the coast, reported seeing the Messerschmitt hit the water approximately 2 miles offshore. There was no explosion, just the impact of metal against water. Rescue boats were dispatched immediately, racing to the crash site. But when they arrived, there was nothing. No pilot in the water. No parachute. Just debris from the aircraft floating on the surface, and an oil slick spreading across the waves. Franz von Werra, the man who had survived being shot down over England, captivity, multiple escape attempts, a brutal Canadian winter, and a journey across the world, was gone. The North Sea had claimed him just months after his triumphant return. He was 27 years old. His body was never recovered. The irony was not lost on anyone. The only German POW to successfully escape from Canada and return home, a man who had defied impossible odds and become a legend, had died not in combat against the enemy, but in a mechanical failure during a routine patrol. It seemed impossibly cruel, as if fate itself had waited until his moment of greatest triumph before collecting its debt. In Germany, the news of his death was received with shock and sadness. The propaganda value of his story was now doubled. He was both an escape hero and a fallen warrior. His story was told and retold, inspiring other prisoners to attempt escapes and encouraging German forces to never give up, no matter the odds. Books were published, his exploits becoming part of Luftwaffe legend. The British and Canadians, upon hearing of his death, had mixed reactions. Officially, he was an enemy combatant, and his death was simply another casualty of war. Unofficially, many of the guards and officials who had dealt with him expressed a grudging respect. He had been a worthy adversary, determined, clever, and honorable within the rules of war. Some even felt a sense of loss that such an exceptional individual had died so pointlessly. Franz von Werra's legacy lives on. His story became the subject of the 1957 film, The One That Got Away, based on a book by Kendall Burt and James Leeser. His escape remains unique in the history of World War II. No other German POW held in Canada successfully escaped and returned to Germany. His determination, ingenuity, and refusal to accept defeat made him a legend on both sides of the conflict. Today, historians and military enthusiasts still study his escape, analyzing what made it possible. It was a combination of factors: his personal determination, careful observation and planning, willingness to take calculated risks, ability to think creatively under pressure, and, crucially, timing. His escape occurred before security measures were tightened, before the U.S. entered the war, and at a moment when international law created a loophole he could exploit. But perhaps the most important element was simply the man himself. Franz von Werra refused to be a prisoner. While others accepted their fate and settled into the routine of POW life, he never stopped fighting. Every day was a day spent planning, observing, preparing for the next opportunity. That relentless determination, that absolute refusal to give up, is what made his escape possible and what makes his story compelling even 8 decades later. His final resting place is somewhere in the cold waters of the North Sea, but his story lives on, a reminder that human determination can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, and that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with weapons, but with will, courage, and an unbreakable spirit. Franz von Werra, the one that got away, escaped from the British and made it back home, and in doing so, he secured his place in history.